Okay, everybody, this is Neuro 10. I did say in the email we're doing 11 and 12, and I went, oh no, we haven't done the cranial nerves. We're doing lecture 10 today. And what I'm going to do before I do lecture 10 is go back over the reflex arc. And when I go over that and the structures involved so you understand it really well, then I'm going to go through the cranial nerves, which are on the base of the brain. And during my presentation, I'm going to ask 10 questions. And those 10 questions pertain to today's lecture. So you're going to have to listen very, very carefully. First thing I want to do is go over what you already know. I just want to use this as something of a reminder. Okay. Here is a transverse section going across of the spinal cord. And you can see the white external cord and the gray internal cord, as well as the central canal. You can see the dorsal horns, which are made up of lots of sensory cell bodies. In between, there's an association nerve or an internerve or a associative nerve or interneuron or connective neuron. And the ventral horn right here is made of motor cell bodies. Now, this area right in here is a mixed nerve because the upper portion is sensory and the lower portion and the upper portion sensory is going to the spinal cord. It's an afferent structure. Here is the dorsal root ganglion. You always know the back side of the cord because the dorsal root ganglion and its nerve root is attached to the dorsal side of the cord. So that is sensory, and it's going towards the cord. It's afferent. The connection is with the dorsal horn and the cell bodies, the sensory cell bodies, the interneuron here, the ventral horn, and exiting the ventral horn are the motor neurons. And here is the motor roots right here. There's the motor roots, and it's exiting the cord. This is an efferent structure. It's going away from the cord, and it's motor. Because afferent and efferent are in juxtaposition, sensory nerve, motor nerve are bundled together in juxtaposition to one another. That makes this the mixed nerve. Okay. This also illustrates the fact that the cord, just like the brain, has three meninges: the dura mater, the arachnoid, and then hugging the actual cord itself is the pia mater. Dura mater, arachnoid, and pia mater. And of course, the central canal sends cerebral spinal fluid down through the center of the entire cord, and the outside of the cord within the pia mater is also bathed and made moist by cerebral spinal fluid that's constantly forming from the choroid plexus of the pia mater, and reabsorbed by the arachnoid villus of the arachnoid layer. Okay, so that is an overview, and these, of course, are spinal nerves. Spinal nerves are mixed nerves, motor and sensory. Okay. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of transparencies which explain again or reiterate again the reflex arc. If you remember correctly, a reflex is an unpremeditated, that means you don't think about it, you don't meditate on it, it's unpremeditated response to a given stimulus. And here we mentioned at the very end of the last lecture that you have 5 structures involved in the reflex arc. You have the receptors. In this case, let's imagine the receptors are the skin for pain, temperature, all of that, anything that may constitute a reflex or response to avoid the danger. Here is the receptor, and these are sensory receptors and dendrites. They're carrying the message afferently going towards the cord. Now it shows one long blue cord here, but I want you to imagine sensory afferent neuron to sensory neuron to sensory neuron to sensory neuron. It's going to go in the back door. It always does. And here is the artist's rendition of the dorsal root ganglion. And here is the dorsal root entering the back door of the spinal cord here. Here's the dorsal horn. Okay. Now, I'm sorry I didn't turn that off. Here's the dorsal root. Remember, sensory always goes in the back door. Here's the artist's associative neuron right here. And here is, or interneuron or connective neuron. Here's the motor neuron. Here is a clump of cell bodies, these nuclei and their nuclei. I hope that did it again. Okay, thank you for being patient. Here's the associative neuron, and here is the motor neuron going towards motor, towards the effector, and the effector is a muscle or a gland. In this case, a muscle that will pull the limb or the hand away from the culprit that's burning it or hurting it. This is an example, another example of a reflex arc. And to show it in action, this is what the doctor always does. And so you'll understand in the clinic that when the doctor wants to test your reflexes, he does it with a little mallet like this. And he has you put your leg over the side of the exam table. He takes the little mallet and he stimulates this ligament known as the patellar ligament. When he does, your sensory afferent neurons, this is the receptor, your sensory afferent neurons, sensory, will go all the way to the cord. There's the dorsal root ganglion. Here is the posterior root or dorsal root actually attaching to the dorsal side of the cord, makes a connection with the interneuron. Here is the motor exiting the ventral portion of the cord, motor to the muscle, which is the effector, and then you pop your knee up or you make a response. And what he's doing here is testing your reflexes. Sometimes it doesn't move, so he has to make the little patellar bump a number of times to hit just right to see if that reflex is good and strong. This is the classic reflex arc. Now keep in mind, in the reflex arc, you're going to see, I'll show you this. In the reflex arc, you're going to respond to the stimulus first, and then afterwards, you're made aware of just what happened. So you touch your hand to a hot stove or to an iron. Your receptors in the skin are injured or burned or stimulated. That's the receptor, sensory afferent neurons to the cord, and then it makes the reflex to the motor neurons through the transverse cord to the motor neurons, and the effectors move away from the culprit. Then after you jerk your hand away, then the message goes up one of these tracks, and the artist has colored different tracks in the white portion of the spinal cord. And these tracks are either afferent going up or efferent going down. They don't go in the same direction at the same. They are separated. Either they're afferent going to the brain or efferent coming down. They don't. Hold on just a minute. Jan, I'll call you later. I'm online right now teaching a class. All right. All right. Bye-bye. Thank you again. I'm leaving that off so it might start to buzz. Okay. I'm not going to start over. But just keep in mind these tracks, and they're tracks because they're in the CNS. They either ascend or descend. Here, the sensory are illustrated by the artist in blue, and he's illustrating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 ascending tracks going to the brain, and those that are descending are illustrated in red. These are descending tracks coming down from the brain. Now, what they can do is, if you decide, for example, to pick up your pencil, you make the decision with the frontal lobe of the brain. The message comes from the precentral gyrus, goes through the basal nuclei, which release, there's dopamine and acetylcholine. It then will go through the thalamus, where the thalamus directs it down the brainstem, midbrain, pons, medulla, down through the spinal cord, and through one of these descending tracks, it will then enter the ventral portion of the cord and exit as the ventral root to the by motor neurons to the effectors, or the muscles that you use to pick up. Now, that is a direct decision. That is not a reflex arc, which is an unpremeditated response. This is a meditated response, which you've made by the frontal lobe, precentral gyrus, which is gross and fine motor movements, down through the brain stem, down through the descending tracts, and through the ventral portion of the cord, and out the ventral portion where the motor root is attached to the muscles. Okay, I hope that makes it a little bit clearer to you. Now, I'm going to use that one again because I'm going to show you. I'm just going to briefly mention the blood supply to the cord. The cord, just like the brain, the cord needs a healthy supply of blood to keep the neurons and the neuroglia alive. So they need oxygenation and glucose and fructose and galactose and vitamins and minerals, just like the brain does. So this is provided by the capillaries. Now, we talked about the brain the other day, and the capillaries that are provided by the external and internal carotids, which break down to smaller arteries, arterioles, capillaries, where the exchange is made. Same thing with the spinal cord, except you've got 3 major blood vessels that take care of your cord. Now, looking here on this diagram, and you can see these and all these beautiful diagrams in your text on the nervous system. Here's the dorsal side again. You can always tell by the dorsal root ganglion. This is what they call the posterior, because it's on the back side of the spinal cord, median sulcus right there. And you have on the posterior median sulcus, if you look over to the roots, the dorsal roots on either side, you have an artery on either side of the dorsal roots that breaks down to arterioles and capillaries, wrap around the spinal cord and feed the cord. On the ventral side of the cord, you have a major blood vessel right here on what we call the anterior median fissure. And that fissure contains a major blood vessel, which breaks down to arterioles and capillaries and then feeds the anterior portion of that spinal cord. So these two posterior arteries and this ventral artery in the anterior median fissure, this is a fissure on the anterior or ventral side of the cord, but on the dorsal, it is a sulcus. And you know the difference between a sulcus and a fissure. And that is what is taking care of the oxygen and food requirements for the cord, just like the carotids did for the brain. And remember, the middle of the brain is also fed by blood vessels that come off the right and left subclavian and move through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae and enter the middle of the brain and up through the center of the brain. And you'll learn lots of detail about that when you discuss the cardiovascular system in AP2. We'll get into much more of a discussion about it then, but I want you to know that today and then how the spinal cord is fed. Okay, now I would like you to open up your text and open up your text, and in edition 15, please look on page 422. And on page 422, you see the base of the brain. Now, I wish I had a model of the brain here. If I knew I was going to be teaching all these hours at home, I would have brought one of the brains, the model of the brain home so I could show you this. But imagine you take the brain and you turn it in this direction so that you see the base of the brain. And if you do that, you'll see the artist's rendition on 1125, figure 1125, page 422, of the cranial nerves. You see them right here. Keep that open. And the reason I want you to keep that open is because I'm going to touch or talk about each one of these cranial nerves, their location and what they do. And the best way to learn that is to look at the base of the brain right here as we discuss each and every one of them. Okay, if you'll give me a minute, y'all are so gracious about that. If you'll give me just a minute, I will get my notes together. Have that page open, page 422, and at the same time, I want you, as you're looking at these nerves, I want you to follow along in your notes. And I've already started lecture 10 in a discussion of the blood supply to the cord. And then I talked again about the reflex arc. So look on page 24, lecture 10. And while you're doing that, you open up to that, please. I'll give you a second. Okay. If you've got all that open, I want you to then write down on a piece of paper questions 1 through 10. And this will be your quiz over lecture 10, over what I'm discussing today. So you're going to have to listen very carefully, as you've always done, I'm sure. And these are 10 questions rather than 5. So I'm counting these as a double quiz, and they're due in again Then tomorrow, let's say at 6 o'clock. So you have 24 hours that you can carefully listen to this lecture and answer these questions and email them back. I did email to you yesterday instructions, or maybe in the day before, instructions on how to do that. You send it to susancangel@comcast.net. Do not send it. Do not send it to my school mail, but to this mail. So I'll get it directly from you. And you mention your name, quiz 2, and numbers 1 through 10 on that same page. Okay, so now that you understand that, let me ask number 1. In the reflex arc, what type of neuron connects sensory to motor? And I'll say that twice. You can always stop and write that question down if you want to. Or if you know the answer, you can jot that down right now. And when everything's over, if you know all the answers, you can send it on to me right away and make 200 points, which is 2 quizzes. In the reflex arc, what type of neuron connects the sensory to the motor? And this is in a transverse section through the spinal cord. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, what part of the spinal cord do neurons exit? In what part of the spinal cord, and these are motor neurons, do motor neurons exit? Okay, all of you are going to make 100 on this. This is going to be great for your average. And number 3, what an unpremeditated response to a given stimulus is known as an unpremeditated response to a given stimulus is known as that's for number 3. And number 4, in what part of the spinal cord do sensory neurons enter? In what part of the spinal cord do sensory neurons enter? Okay, there's the first 4 questions. Now the next 6. You'll have to listen carefully as we go on. All right. Looking on page 422 at the base of the brain, the artist has illustrated all of those cranial nerves in canary yellow. Okay, I think I would have done it in a different color, but follow along as we discuss. Now in class, I would have this on the overhead projector and blown up real big, and you could see it, but you're just going to have to follow along in your textbook as I discuss them. Okay. All right. Now when we talk about the cranial nerves, we're talking about peripheral nerves because these nerves are outside the brain. So anytime these structures are outside the brain, we call them nerves. If these structures were inside the brain, they're tracts. Now, part of each one of these nerves is inside of the brain. So while it's in the brain, it's called a tract. When it's outside, it's a nerve. Now, there are, and we mentioned before, there are 31 pair of spinal nerves. That means 62 spinal nerves altogether coming out through those vertebrae, all the way from the base of the brain, all the way down to the sacrum. There's 31 pair or 62. But in the brain, you have 12 pair of cranial nerves, or 24 altogether. Now, these 12 cranial nerves, all of them, with the exception of 2, all of them, that means 10, come off the brainstem. The brainstem being the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. 10 of them off the brainstem, 2 of them actually come from the brain. And those 2 that come from the brain are the first and second cranial nerves, oculomotor and optic. They come directly from the brain, as if it's an outgrowth from the brain. They're not from the brain stem. Now, in all of these 12 cranial nerves, there are 9 cranial nerves. The first 9 pair and the 12th pair. So 1 through 9 and the 12th pair. These cranial nerves take care of sensory innervation and motor innervation of the head. They're totally involved with the head. But number 10 and 11, which is 10 is the vagus nerve and 11 is the accessory nerve, then these 2 nerves are actually going to go down through the throat, innervate the trapezius muscles, and the vagus goes all the way down to the dorsal side of the large intestines. So those are 2 nerves that actually exit the head. But the other 10 nerves, 1 through 9 and the 12th, take care of the head itself. All of these nerves, as you look at them from the base, we begin at the top of the head towards the frontal lobe, and we go down towards the occipital. And they're numbered 1 through 12 in Roman numerals. We can use number 1, number 2, or Roman numerals. Remember, this is an international information, so we use all the Latin and Greek derivated terms that we can. These nerves, some of these cranial nerves are sensory. That means they only send a message to the brain, such as the olfactory nerve, which is smell, and the optic nerve, which is vision. They're both sensory. They pick up from their receptors information. For the eyes, it would be photoreceptors, light receptors in the retina. And for olfaction, it would be in your receptor organ, the nose, afferent sensory neurons for the sense of smell. Both of these are sensory, completely sensory, and don't have a motor function. The rest of the neurons, some of them are sensory, some again are motor, and some are mixed. That means the fibers have both a sensory and a motor function. Okay. Now, the first one is olfactory. The word olfaction means to smell. This is purely sensory. And if you look at your notes, you'll see that these nerves come from millions of tiny sensory afferent neurons for smell in the nasal mucosa of your nose. These sensory neurons for smell, olfaction neurons, or olfactory neurons, they pick up on chemicals that are in the air that dissolve in that nasal mucosa and are picked up and carried to the brain. Now, the beauty of the olfactory nerve, and one thing that's very interesting about it, and I mentioned this to you before, is the olfactory nerve is the only nerve that actually bypasses the thalamus and takes a straight shot to the brain deep within the temporal lobes for your sense of smell. It bypasses the thalamus, straight shot to the brain. That is olfaction. Now, I was hoping that you would, in your dissection of the sheep brain, and I usually dissect the sheep brain when we're finished with the cranial nerves, because we can look at the bottom of the sheep brain and pick out many of these cranial nerves. One of the most interesting, because it's so large, is the the sensory bulb. The afferent sensory neurons carry the message for smell, and they take them right up to that olfactory bulb and then sends it from that olfactory bulb to the receptors, or remember, not receptors, but to the areas that are stimulated deep within the temporal lobe. But that's olfaction, and it's a large nerve in sheep. It is extremely large in many animals. We don't have the largest olfactory bulb as some animals. I think the animal that I can pick out that, as far as I know, has the most sensitive sense of smell and can smell thousands and thousands of times better than we can are the bloodhounds. And they have that nice long schnoz that is just full of afferent sensory neurons for olfaction. Okay, olfactory, number one. Number two is the optic nerve. Now, the optic nerve, if you look on your diagram of these cranial nerves, the artist has cut off, or it looks like the artist has actually snipped off these nerves so that you can easily see them. But I've got some videos I'm going to give you today when I send back the information, when I email you, on some videos I want you to watch for this set of 12 cranial nerves, which make it even clearer. They're really beautiful videos. I did find them. I've been looking for them. But that is the optic nerve. The optic nerve also comes out of the cerebrum, just like the olfactory nerve, but the optic nerve does have to pass through the thalamus before it reaches the occipital lobe of the brain, where it registers sight. Now, your eye is the receptor organ for the optic nerve. The retina is full of thousands of afferent sensory neurons called rods and cones. We'll discuss them at length in the next week or so when we talk about the structure and function of the eye. But the photoreceptors are the rods and cones. They pick up on light and color, which is reflected off of objects. It goes through the media of the eye. It's registered on the retina, and it exits the back portion of the eye by the optic nerve. Now, that optic nerve does something that's interesting, and you can see it easily on that diagram on this page. The optic nerve forms a chiasma and crosses over. And the interesting thing about this chiasma is that it crosses over, passes through the thalamus and to either lobe, either occipital lobe on either side of the back of the head, so that when you look with your right eye at an object, those photoreceptors are going to the right side of the occipital lobe, and some of them are crossing over at the optic chiasma and registering on the left side. The same thing with the right or the left eye. Then you've got some of those photoreceptors, which are a straight shot from the optic nerve through the thalamus to the occipital lobe, and some of them cross over at the chiasma and register on the right occipital lobe. So you actually see with both sides. If you're looking just through your left eye, you're seeing with both sides of the brain, and the same thing with the right. But that is the optic nerve. Now, the next nerve, oculomotor. Oculo refers to eye. Motor means activity. Oculomotor, that is the third. The fourth, the trochlear. And the sixth, the abducens. I'm skipping trigeminal right now, but I want you to link or put together oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens. I want you to clump these three nerves together because all of these nerves are responsible for motor movements of the eye. If we're talking about the blinking of the levator palpebrae superioris, which is in the eyelid, or the orbicularis oculi, which enables you to close your eyes, or we're talking about the constriction of the pupil, which means that the iris, which is a muscle in the eye, it constricts to let less light through the pupil, or it dilates. These three nerves work on motor activity around the eye. And number 6, abducens, is important when you look to the side or you abduct the eye. So when you look to the right with your right eye, then that is enabled because of the abducens, and to the left because of the abducens. So it abducts those eyes away from the midline of the body. Ocular motor, trochlear, and abducens. Trigeminal, that's number 5. Trigeminal is a monster of a nerve. It is a big nerve. And if you look here on the base, it doesn't look so large as it emanates or comes from the brain stem. But if you look at a lateral view of the trigeminal, it is quite large. And there is a lateral view on page 423, figure 11.26. And I think I have one for you. Look at that right now. At least I thought I did. But look at that. What I have is a transparency of that figure. So if you look at the figure that I'm looking at here, you'll see on the right side, on the lateral view, each one of these nerves, of course, is paired. And this is showing you the right trigeminal nerve in 11.26. And they call it trigeminal because it has 3 branches. And the geminal would be the germinating layer. It spreads into 3 different branches. One branch is ophthalmic, and it, as you can see, it sends nerves around the eye. That's the ophthalmic branch. It is a sensory branch. Your eyes have probably more afferent sensory neurons for pain in the eye area than any other place in the body. So if you have an inflammation of the eye, such as conjunctivitis, or you get an eyelash underneath your contact, which feels like a 2 before, anything dust or anything in your eye, or if your eye is dry, this branch of the trigeminal nerve sends innervation to the brain, letting you know of that discomfort. And the reason that is there is for your protection. If you have conjunctivitis, then you do something about it. If you have an eyelash under your contact, you certainly do something about it, because this sensory portion of the trigeminal lets you know it. Notice you also have a maxillary, and the maxillary branch is the second or middle branch, and it goes to the nose area and the maxillary area of the upper portion of the maxilla. This is used in chewing or in mastication of your food. And then you have a mandibular branch, which comes all the way down and innervates the jaw. So the maxillary and the mandibular branch are very important in chewing or masticating your food. That is a motor activity, whereas the ophthalmic branch picks up on discomfort in the eye. That is a sensory portion. So all of these are bundled together with connective tissue, and this nerve is mixed, having sensory and motor function, and they're bundled together. So that is the trigeminal. Now, when I say it's a monster of a nerve, when you look at it on the lateral view as it innervates these structures in your face, it's quite large. It's thick. It is not the longest nerve in the body. The longest nerve in the body is the vagus. But as far as the cranial nerves, this is probably the thickest of the cranial nerves. Now, look at before I go any further on that, I do want to mention, anytime you have pain in a location of the body, that pain is caused by sensory neurons registering the pain. It's referred to as neuralgia. And this nerve being highly sensitive, if it is irritated or inflamed, you can develop a condition known as tic douloureux. It kind of sounds, it's always sounded to me like, oh, here's a basketball coach. Here he comes, tic douloureux. It's a French term which refers to neuralgia, specifically of the trigeminal nerve. Thank goodness I've never had it, but I've heard a lot about it, and it's supposed to be extremely painful. I did have a student whose mother had tic douloureux and had it for several months. I don't know how she stood it for several months, and they did a number of modalities trying to alleviate, and they eventually had to go through and deaden that nerve, which is dangerous because the nerve is important, but she was in so much pain, they ended up having to deaden that nerve to give her some relief. But that condition is tic douloureux. And I wanted to mention that to you, so if you ever hear it, you haven't heard it for the first time. All right, the next nerve is the facial nerve. Now, the trigeminal, remember, has the ophthalmic branch, the maxillary, and the mandibular, like that. Okay, but the facial nerve is multi-branched on either side. You have a branch up here on the temple, here below the eye. You have another branch here on the maxillary, here on the mandible, and one on the throat. And that is on both sides. That is the facial nerve. This nerve is primarily motor, and it is the nerve that gives us facial expressions. If you remember when we were talking about the skull and the bones of the skull, and we were talking about the muscles that lie on top of those bones, those muscles that are your facial muscles, those muscles contract and give you facial expression. And your facial expression comes from the facial nerve. And you only have that facial expression is totally muscular. The only movable joint you have in the skull after the plates fuse is the mandibular joint for chewing and talking. So your expression is from contraction, relaxation of a number of these muscles, and it's the facial nerve that innervates, facial nerve on both sides. It's a motor function in that facial expression, but it also has a sensory portion to it too, so it's mixed. And the sensory has to do with salivary glands, and some of your sense of taste comes from that. Salivary glands, even your lacrimal glands, and a sense of taste. So it's mixed. Now, a condition that affects the facial nerve, and you've heard about tic douloureux with the trigeminal, the condition that can affect this facial nerve, and it's not uncommon, and you'll see it in your medical practice. You'll see it. And that is known as Bell's palsy. And Bell's palsy can affect someone, a child, an adolescent, a teenager, an adult, all the way through life. Through the lifespan, a person can be afflicted with Bell's palsy. And it is, the etiology is not completely known. It does affect the nerves of the face. And when it is affecting that facial nerve, the muscles around the eye can slack, the muscles of the jaw can slack, and the mandibular portion, these muscles can also slack. It's not a terribly dangerous condition, except for the area around the eye, because when this muscle slacks, it leaves that lower lid open a greater degree, and the tears may not go completely down over that entire eyeball. The tears have lysozyme in it, which is a bactericide, and helps us keep from having an infection or conjunctivitis, bacterial or viral infection. But you get a higher degree of that when someone has Bell's palsy. It looks like they've had a stroke. They haven't. It's Bell's. It's not a stroke, but you don't know until it's investigated. And I remember a number of years ago when I was living over not very far from U of M, there was a workman that we had hired, and he came over on Saturday and he was building a bookcase for us. Lovely gentleman, and an extremely good carpenter, and so we became good friends. My husband and I became good friends, but he was every Saturday morning about 9 o'clock. He'd ring the doorbell and he'd work a few hours. Well, one Saturday morning he rang the doorbell and I opened it up, and he was very, very upset. And this side of his face was slacking, and he was having trouble talking. And he said he had woken up like that, and he didn't know what was wrong. But since I teach anatomy, he knew I'd probably figure it out. So I said, no, I don't think I can diagnose this, and I shouldn't. I'm an anatomy teacher. I'm not an MD. And so I said, I thought he could have had a stroke. So I didn't know if it was Bell's palsy or a stroke, but you always err on the side of a stroke. You think of the worst and take it from there. So I said, I'm going to drive you to ER, and I don't want you driving, because I thought if he's driving, he had another stroke, we could have a wreck. So I said, I'll drive. You get in my car. And I drove him to ER, and we were there a few hours, like you always are. And they came back, and the diagnosis was Bell's palsy. Now, there are treatments for it, and Bell's palsy can last 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, 30 years. They don't tell a patient that it can be that long. And it's usually very, very rare for Bell's palsy to be that long. So 3 weeks to 3 months is the longest. That's what I've heard. And but it's quite upsetting, and they're very self-conscious because it looks like they've had a stroke, and they drool because they can't keep that lip up, and it affects the lateral side of the tongue. So they have a lot of trouble with it. But that's Bell's palsy for the facial nerve, particularly for the trigeminal. Okay, the next nerve is the vestibulocochlear. That is the 8th nerve, and find that, please, on the base of the brain. Vestibulocochlear nerve is also known as the acoustic nerve, also known as the auditory nerve, Now, the word vestibulocochlear is a better description, and I'm giving you that term to really learn vestibulocochlear nerve, because it says exactly what it does. This nerve gives you your sense of balance, or it is responsible for part of your ability to maintain balance. That is the vestibular portion of it, and the cochlear portion of it gives you your sense of hearing. Now, when they tell you the acoustic nerve or the auditory nerve, I think that only tells part of the story. Acoustic tiles, if we were in the classroom, you could look up at the ceiling, and those tiles are acoustic tiles. They're tiles that have hundreds of little holes in it that absorb sound. Acoustic to absorb sound. So that is the hearing side of it. Auditory means sound. And that occurs in the vestibular portion. When we get into studying the structures of the ear, I'll show you the vestibular portion of the inner ear that gives you your sense of balance. You get your balance from the vestibular portion of the inner ear. That's the reason if someone has vertigo or they've lost their sense of balance, that is the first structure they investigate. The vestibular portion of that nerve works synergistically. Remember, that works together with the proprioceptive sense that comes up from your body, giving you your awareness or cognition of where your muscles are in space and time, and also your cerebellum. And the cerebellum helps you with balance. So the proprioceptive nerves, the cerebellum, and the vestibular portion of the vestibular cochlear nerve gives you your balance. The cochlear portion of it means snail because that portion of the inner ear looks like a snail. And inside of that are thousands of sensory afferent neurons for sound, and that's the cochlear portion. So that's the reason I prefer vestibular cochlea. So it tells you, yes, it's there for sound and hearing, whereas acoustic and auditory just refer to sound. Glossopharyngeal, that is the 9th cranial nerve. The word glosso means tongue. Pharyngeal means throat. Glossopharyngeal is sensory and motor. The glosso portion, or the tongue, would help you with your sense of taste. And remember, you get part of your sense of taste also from the facial nerve, which was the 7th cranial nerve. But the 9th cranial nerve, the glosso portion, gives you another ability to sense taste. And the pharyngeal comes from the word pharynx, which is swallowing. So it's a mixed nerve. Taste would be sensory, and pharyngeal would be motor. Now, the 10th cranial nerve, which is kind of my favorite nerve to discuss, is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve. 10th cranial nerve. Now, of all the nerves, it is the longest. And it is the first nerve we discuss that actually does not have an effect on for the most part, on the head. The vagus nerve starts on the brain stem, comes all the way down through the neck, through the thorax, down through the abdomen, even to the dorsal side of the large intestines. Okay. This nerve, for the most part, or 75% of this nerve, is involved with the parasympathetic response, or that response which puts us in the parasympathetic mode. And that is the rest and digest mode. That is the mode that we have when we are relaxed. Now, what happens when we're relaxed with this nerve? And this nerve, this portion of the nerve, of course, is motor. When you're relaxed, your pupils are constricted, your blood pressure is lowered, your heartbeat is lowered, okay? Your digestion and your elimination speeds up. So this vagus nerve speeds up some of your gastrointestinal activity and slows down others. Constricts the eyes, lowers the blood pressure, so it affects cardiovascular. It lowers the number of heartbeats that you need per second. You're not in tachycardia, which is a fast heartbeat that you see in the sympathetic response. So it lowers that, and yet it speeds up digestion and elimination. So it slows some things down and speeds others up. And that's one of the responsibilities of the parasympathetics, and lowers respirations too. I forgot to add that. I like to call it, I like to talk about this nerve because all of us are well acquainted with the life of our most famous entertainer here, the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. And I like to tell students that it was the vagus nerve that done him in, not Las Vegas, but the vagus nerve. And what I can tell you is that he was addicted to speed and barbiturates. So he was addicted to amphetamines so that he could work, and he took barbiturates so he could sleep, and took them in high doses. He slept during the day, and he usually worked all night. So he would take the barbiturates early in the morning, 4 or 5 o'clock, and sleep most of the day. And then when he woke up, he would take the amphetamines so that he could be alert and work. Well, he woke up, and it was sometime during the day. He woke up during the day, and he went into the restroom, and he had a bowel movement. Now, in the dorsal side of the colon are nerves, the vagus nerves. And he was on barbiturates, which would stimulate the parasympathetic response of the vagus nerve and make him tired and let him sleep. So everything was slowed down, even his heart rate was slowed down. And then we had the bowel movement. He stimulated the vagus nerve in the dorsal side of the colon, which slowed his heart even further. So the king fell off the throne and died, and died from a heart attack. So when they said that he had a heart attack, they were not lying. He did have a heart attack, but part of it had been induced by the drugs. Now, he probably had a condition prior to that was undiagnosed, because his mother died at the age, I believe, of 42 of a major heart attack, and he did as well at the age of 42. So he was quite young, but his system was confused. It was either going at the speed of a locomotive and then coming to a stop, and his heart just wasn't able to take it. So it was the vagus nerve that probably did him in. Okay, with that in mind, let's go to number 5. And number 5 reads, which nerve is made of fibers that are primarily parasympathetic? And you better get this one. Which nerves are primarily parasympathetic? And I'll give you a minute to think about that. Number 6. Give me the name of the nerve which is the thickest or the largest. I'm not talking about the longest, but the thickest or largest of the cranial nerves. For number 6. Number 7, I would like the name of the nerve, and it's a mixed nerve for facial expression, which would be the motor portion of this nerve, and the sense of taste, which would be sensory portion of this nerve. But it's primarily utilized as a nerve for facial expression for number 7. Number 8, what nerve stimulates the occipital lobe? What nerve stimulates the occipital lobe. And that was number 8. Okay, let's go on and talk about the 11th cranial nerve, which is the accessory nerve. This is primarily a motor nerve, comes off the brainstem. Remember, 10 of these nerves come off the brainstem. Only the olfactory and optic nerves come directly from the brain. And this nerve innervates the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Now, if you remember correctly from our discussion of the muscles, the sternocleidomastoid muscle has its origin on the sternum and on the clavicle, and it inserts on the mastoid process, so that when this muscle contracts, you turn your head to the left. When the other muscle contracts, you turn your head to the right, the other sternomastoid. And when you bow forward, as in praying for your anatomy quiz, both of these muscles constrict and you bow your head forward. Sometimes they're called the praying muscle. Well, it's the accessory muscle, the 11th cranial muscle, that innervates the trapezius and the sternomastoid muscles. Now, the trapezius portion of it, when you stimulate this muscle, it enables you to shrug your shoulders or relax, the shrugging muscle. And the trapezius also enables you, when it contracts, to keep your head erect or hyperextend when this contracts. And that is the back side of the trapezius, which inserts on the occipital lobe so that you can extend and hyperextend your head. That is the accessory nerve, affecting the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid. Now, in the praying muscle, in the sternocleidomastoid, the trapezius has to relax so that you can bow your head forward. And the sternocleidomastoid relaxes when the trapezius is innervated, so you can extend and hyperextend the head. That's the accessory muscle. Now, the 12th muscle, hypoglossal. And we've already talked about the fact that the word glossal means tongue. Hypo means below. So this is the nerve below the tongue. It is a motor nerve and affects the muscles of the tongue. The muscles of the tongue are extremely important in the process of mastication, in chewing your food, making sure that the food is in between your teeth. Your tongue is involved in that, and your tongue is also very important so that you can enunciate your words and be understood. That is the hypoglossal nerve, hypoglossal. Now, I'll continue. I still have 2 more questions. Number 9, this is the only nerve that bypasses the thalamus. This is the only nerve that bypasses the thalamus. What nerve is that? Bypasses the thalamus for number 9. And number 10. How many nerves, for number 10, originate from the brainstem? How many of these cranial nerves come off that brainstem? Okay, number those 1 through 10 in line and email them to me. Don't write them on a piece of paper and take a picture. You email them to me. And please follow those instructions. I would appreciate it. Now, I am going to let you do the discussion of the spinal nerves, which is on page 25. That's just a few sentences, and I've gone over those quite a bit. The only thing I want to mention to you, I've already gone over, the discussion of the dorsal root ganglion, the dorsal root, the inside, the gray matter of the spinal cord, the ventral motor root. I've discussed that. The only thing I want to draw your attention to is that the 31 pair or the 62 cranial nerves, they're named according to their location on the vertebra. So you have 8 pair of cervical nerves. These are numbered C1 through C8. This is important to know because if there is an injury or break or tear in that spinal cord, it could be anywhere from C1 to C8. The higher the injury, the greater the damage. So if you have a really high injury of the spinal cord, then you can be paralyzed from the neck down. If you have an injury in the thoracic region of the spinal cord, you may be able to move your head and arms, but paralyzed from the waist down. Now, there are 8 pairs of cervical nerves, even though there's only 7 cervical vertebrae, because the first pair of the cervical nerves is above the atlas. There's the atlas and the axis, and it's above the atlas. So that accounts for the 1 extra pair of the cervical, C1 through C8. The thoracic are T1 through T12. The lumbar are L1 through L5. The sacral nerves, S1 through S5. And you have 1 pair, the coccygeal nerve, which is designated CO, the coccygeal nerve. Okay, I will email you a little bit more information. Please get that quiz back to me within 24 hours, about 6 o'clock tomorrow night. And I will email you some more instructions on some videos I want you to see. You're not able to dissect the brain. So I have mentioned to you that I wanted you to look at those brain dissections online so you can see it, even though you can't have your hands on the brain in the lab. We'll do the same thing with the eyeball. And I do want you to look at the slides, which show the bone cells, the muscle cells, smooth, striated, and cardiac, as well as neuronal cells. I want you to look at those slides so that you can see what they do look like under a microscope. You can actually recognize them. There's also beautiful photographs of these slides in your textbook as well. Well, we've been working for 1 hour and 7 minutes, so I think we've gotten probably altogether about 11 hours of video on neuro. I thank you very much. I will let you know when video 11 and 12 is coming up. Today was 10. So get those to me within the next 24 hours and stay safe and be healthy. And I sure wish I was in class with you. All right. Have a good evening. Good night.